might of the U.S. industry mobilized behind the war effort. The Pacific Fleet had been severely damaged. The country needed ships to take the fight back to Japan. Across America, shipyards sprang into action to build the hardware that would avenge Pearl Harbor. 11 shipyards were given the task to build the new destroyers. As ship after ship rolled off the production line, the call went out for sailors to man them.
I was 17 years old, and I enlisted 8 days after turning 17, and about 3 days later I was sworn in and on my way to San Diego.
I'd been to Boy Scout camp, but it was a far cry from that because everything went by the book, it went by the bell, it went by the whistle, and the chief made us march up and down, and we had to go to bed at a certain time and get up at a certain time, take a shower every day, and shave. I was 17 years old, shaving. I didn't have anything to shave.
Straight from boot camp, these men, some as young as 16, were sent to the U.S. Navy's most advanced destroyers. For many, it would be love at first sight.
Well, I loved it immediately. That's called the Dungaree Navy. All one crew, really. Officers and men were one group together. Destroyer is a special thing unto itself. It has the speed and it throbs, and you know you're at sea on those things. So it was something I found exhilarating.
But the bloody fight for the Pacific had intensified. Japan conquered everything before her. American forces had to control the seas before they could retake the islands. The destroyer would be in the thick of the battles. June 1942, Midway. In an unforgiving battle, the U.S. Navy's aircraft sank 4 of Japan's frontline aircraft carriers, but at a price. The carrier USS Yorktown was also sunk. At the very same hour, 7 time zones away, the first of the new breed of destroyers was ready to enter the fight for the Pacific. But its crewmen would soon find out the conditions aboard a U.S. destroyer were a far cry from the comfort enjoyed aboard the bigger capital ships.
The complement of the ship was slightly over 300 officers and crew. And the officers, they lived 2 to a stateroom, and the enlisted people lived 50, 60 in a compartment. And the bunks were just big enough for one person. You didn't turn over too much because you'd fall out. They were stacked either 3 high or 4 high. I was on the bottom bunk, so I was maybe this high off the deck, which meant I could get up easy, just roll out and then start going.
When everything you own goes in a little footlocker that big, you know, it doesn't seem like you're needing space. You know, you got plenty of room. And as long as you got your bunk and mattress, well, you're in pretty good shape.
Heat was tremendous. Of course, you were constantly soaking wet in the tropics. And on deck, it was always well into the hundreds. And you had to try and keep in the shade. If you were away from the landmass and moving at a fairly good clip, it wasn't too bad because you had the air hitting you. But once you got into the channel there around Guadalcanal, the heat was just terrible there.
Hotter than blue blazes. And most of us went up on deck to sleep. And I can remember clearly being on the deck. And when the 5-inch gun would go off, I'd come up off the deck and bounce down and then go right back to sleep.
The food, you know, of course we had good food. You got a little bit tired of it. The old saying used to be that they had the best food in the world until the cooks got it. And then they changed it all, but they did a good job. And we ate real good most of the time.
The food was horrible. You know, I think we had a bad cook, you know. And nobody ever gave 3 cheers for the cook on our ship, I'll tell you. They called out which watch was ready for lunch or dinner, whatever. And of course, they just called it chow. And you got in line, went through with a metal tray, and they threw the food on the tray, and then you sat down and ate, you know. I can't remember having but 1 or 2 good meals all the time I was on that ship.
For the officers, life on board a destroyer was much more comfortable.
The officers lived pretty darn well. By tradition, they had Filipino mess boys in white jackets. The wardroom, with a wardroom table and a couple of places to sit down. We were served on china and silver.
But the conditions in the washroom were another story.
Aft, where I lived, we had 2 showers and, maybe 24 lavatories and 6 toilets. And the toilets were a trough with planks across the trough to sit on and seawater running in one end and out the other. And of course, the ship rolled all the time and pitched, and it was always water on the deck, so your feet always got wet.
When you went into a shower booth, there'd be 4 other guys already in there. So what you did there was kind of lather up and get splashed from these other fellows, and then hopefully get enough water on you to get rid of the soap.
So there's always maybe 8 or 10 naked men standing around, either getting wet or soaping or getting rinsed or whatever.
It was an experience.
But in the washroom, there was one place no one wanted to be: on the red seat.
Back then, during World War II and before, sailors who had a venereal disease, they were considered to have stolen time from the Navy because they couldn't have certain duty, and they were set aside. And whatever time that they lost, they had to tack it on at the end of the enlistment so that the government didn't lose anything. And so rather than have them use the same facilities that everybody else had because might catch something, which of course you couldn't, we didn't know that, they had a separate toilet for that sort of thing.
In the fall of 1942, Fletcher-class destroyers arrived in Guadalcanal and formed an elite fighting unit known as the Cactus Strike Force. It wasn't a moment too soon. Japanese forces were continuing to advance. The technology, engineering, and armament of the destroyer had to pay off. Lives depended on it. By early 1943, the first 5 Fletcher-class destroyers had arrived in the Pacific. They were known as the Cactus Strike Force. Their first job was to target and smash the Japanese supply convoys, ferrying troops used in the invasions of the Pacific Islands.
It's something that's hard to describe. You have no lights. Not any ship has a light showing. And there were all sorts of navigational hazards which you thought of. As a matter of fact, we were using some charts that dated back to the 1700s. We got very close, within 60 miles of the Japanese airfield, so that's why we had to do it at night. And they were coming down mainly to resupply their troops, and they had a sophisticated barge system that would go hug the shoreline and go at night. So our job was to intercept them and try to cut them off. And their job was to get by us.
Already, the role of the destroyers was changing. At first, they were considered only as defense for the capital ships. Now, the Fletchers were being thrown into the furnace of battle.
If there was a strong point you wanted reduced, you called for fire from the ships offshore, and many times it was a destroyer that provided that. They would screen the larger ships, the battleships, carriers, cruisers, performing such duties as lifeguard. Say if a pilot went down or a plane crashed astern of the ship, the destroyer would be there to pick the pilot up, usually rewarded by the carrier with a gallon of ice cream or two for their efforts. They performed convoy escort. In short, any duty that needed a fast ship to go in harm's way, that usually where the Fletchers ended up.
The destroyer was a floating gun platform. The 5.5-inch guns and their devastating firepower were its main armament.
The 5-inch 38 could fire a 54-pound projectile 18,000 yards, which is about 9 nautical miles, about 10.5 statute miles. Had a ceiling of over 35,000 feet for anti-aircraft. Then, of course, it could be used rapid fire for beach invasions and that sort of thing.
Ammunition from the magazines below deck was fed to the guns as fast as they could fire them.
We fired 3 every 3 seconds, but they had to qualify that because that if everything goes proper, these men laying these big projectiles in the tray, they can't hold up too long loading them that fast. Those 3 to 4 seconds was pretty good for 5 or 10 rounds. After that, your fire slows down. It's dirty. You'd be surprised that every time the gun fires, you have grease flying around and gunpowder, and you come out, you're just peppered with grease all over your face and clothes, and very smoky, very noisy.
The Fletcher's 40 and 20 millimeter anti-aircraft guns put up a shield of steel against enemy bombers and fighters. The 40 millimeter rate of fire was 160 rounds per minute. The 20 millimeter, a staggering 450 rounds per minute, enough to shred an aircraft in seconds.
I was a loader on a 40 millimeter gun, which was a good position to be in. The problem was you were so busy loading that you couldn't really look at the plane that was coming in, and if you did, there was always a chance of you losing your concentration on getting that gun loaded. So I tried not to look at the planes coming in.
A command center that controlled all this firepower was deep in the ship. Packed with the latest electronic radar, it could locate the enemy up to 40 miles away. It was known as the CIC.
CIC is the Combat Information Center, and all communications and all the radar returns, all the radar equipment, and most of the radio equipment too was centered in the Combat Information Center. And all during any action of any sort, that's where everything was kept track of.
With its radar tracking anything that moved above the surface, the Fletchers also had the most sophisticated sonar, enabling them to hunt down anything that was below the sea.
As a sonarman, my assignment was to go up on the bridge where the sonar equipment was, and we sent out a signal underwater, a sound signal, and it went out until it hit something, and we could tell by the time that the signal went out and the echo came back, we would get the distance. And so we knew where it was. Then the officer says to the telephone talker, "Fire 1.
Fire 1. Fire
1. Boom, boom, it goes out. Then fire 2, fire 3, fire 4. And so they're going out on both sides of the ship. There are 3 side racks of depth charges, and you have 2 stern racks, and 2 of them are going off at a time. The side racks are 300 pounds of TNT, and the stern is 600 pounds each. So you're putting a lot of explosives down there, and it doesn't have to land on deck. It just has to get close, because it'll open seams. And once you open a seam in a submarine, there's not much else you can do. Sink.
And sink they did. The Fletcher-class destroyer sank 29 Japanese submarines. But sinking a sub was not enough. You had to have proof of a kill.
To determine the kill, well, we put a whaleboat over the side and send a crew around to see what they could pick up, and pick up a lot of flotsam. Sometimes we pick up body parts. The second submarine we sank, we found a piece of lung, and the doctor aboard examined it and said the man had tuberculosis, almost an advanced stage.
The destroyers were always in the thick of action, fighting at close range. Their losses began to mount. On the night of February 1st, 1943, the USS De Haven was spotted by enemy aircraft off the coast of Guadalcanal. The Japanese thought De Haven was an interception force sent to block their evacuation. They hurled a full squadron of dive bombers at the destroyer.
I remember hearing, knowing that there was conversation over the TBS, the talk between ships, that there were bogies in the area, and they were suspected of being Japanese planes. But our captain, for some reason, decided to wait to see if further identification of these planes could be made. And he waited, I guess, too long. And I stepped out on the starboard wing of the bridge and looked back aft, across the top of the stacks, and I saw the first bomber come in. And I watched the bomb being released from beneath the plane. It was that close, and I could see it. It's still a burnt orange color in my mind. It looked like the size of a large ball. And at that instant, I said, I shouldn't be out here in the open. So I jumped inside very quickly into the sonar room. And a moment later, the explosion went off. I think the second bomb that hit knocked out the engine room. And of course, the third one would have to be the one that hit the number 2 gun mount, went down and set off the powder magazine down in the bottom of the ship to blow the bow off, and just blasted the pilot house and the superstructure, pushed it back. I managed to pull myself loose. I just lowered myself about 3 feet into the water, swam away. I saw no other person until I was farther away from the ship. Then I realized there were other heads bobbing around in the water. And I looked back perhaps a few minutes later and watched the ship slide under the water. There were 167 men killed and 38 or 39 wounded.
The De Haven was the first destroyer lost, and the 15th American ship sunk in the bloody Guadalcanal campaign. Unknown to the men of the destroyers, it was just the beginning. Darker days were coming for the ships of the Pacific and their crews. By the spring of 1943, the Fletcher-class destroyer had established itself as a relentless, multi-role attack machine against the Japanese. On constant ready alert, each man's nerves were on edge, waiting the dreaded call.
General quarters, man your battle station.
It was a little bit scary. Usually you left your helmet up at the gun, at your battle station. It was hooked onto the gun up there. So you just grabbed, if you were dressed, you went like you were. If you weren't dressed, you'd try to throw a pair of pants on and get up there as quick as you could. And you'd go up and man your station and then just wait from there to see what was going to happen next.
With the call to general quarters, the men of the destroyers knew they might be sunk. They had a special way of protecting their valuables.
The few little valuables we had, we were always thinking what to do. We would put them in a rubber, we called them in those days, and today they call them condoms. But anyway, we would put all our little valuables in there and then tie a knot in this thing and keep it in our pocket.
On every front, they were involved in close contact battle. Every weapon was used to destroy the enemy. But perhaps one of the strangest weapons was used on the night of April 5th, 1943. The USS O'Bannon and the other destroyers of the Cactus Strike Force were returning from a mission bombarding Japanese shore positions when the O'Bannon picked up a large Japanese submarine on our sonar.
Everybody looked, and sure enough, there was a submarine sitting on the surface. We had a Commodore aboard, and he wanted to ram that submarine, and the captain didn't want to.
Fearing that a collision could cause an explosion, the O'Bannon's captain ordered a hard change of course. As the two ships came within feet of each other, the Japanese were suddenly alerted to the situation.
We got right up to them, and they paid no attention to us, and we were running right alongside of them when they woke up and jumped up and started running around it. Nobody could fire anything. Our smallest guns could not come down to fire on the submarine either. So some of the fellows picked potatoes out of the bins, which were right handy, and started throwing them because there they were, you know. And the Japanese evidently thought they were hand grenades, and so they ran and started throwing them back and throwing them off the submarine before they would blow up. And in that period of time, they did not get to their gun, and we were able to pull away from them and start firing. And then we came back and made a run on them. And evidently, we learned later that we actually did sink the submarine.
A fitting tribute to the men of the O'Bannon was delivered in the form of a plaque. It was sent by the potato growers of Maine. The relentless fight for the Pacific continued through 1943. By 1944, the destroyers had been involved in some of the bloodiest battles of World War II. But it was during the Battle of Leyte Gulf that the fighting men of the Tin Cans became legends. On October 25th, 4 Fletcher-class destroyers were on escort duty, protecting a task force involved in landing operations at Leyte Gulf. 2 of these destroyers were the USS Johnston and the USS Hull. When the Johnston had been commissioned, her captain, Commander Ernest Evans, made a speech to his crew that typified the destroyer man's creed. "This is going to be a fighting ship," he said. "I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now."
I said he had more courage than was good for the rest of us.
The men of the Johnston and Hull thought they were protected from any surface attack by the ships of Admiral Halsey's 7th Fleet and were completely surprised when heavy shells started to land around them. The 2 destroyers were in the gun sights of the Japanese Navy's Center Fleet.
There were 4 battleships in that Japanese fleet, 8 cruisers and 11 or more destroyers. And the Yamato was the largest battleship in the world. They had 18.1-inch guns, and they had 9 of them. And one projectile weighed about 3,400 pounds compared to our 54 pounds for a 5-inch projectile.
Captain Evans, who had promised his men that they were going into harm's way, led his ship in a David and Goliath heroic attack.
The first order I heard him give was all ahead flank, and which meant as fast as you could go. We began making smoke, zigzagging, so he told our gunnery officer to pick out one of those lead cruisers, and we did. And we made the torpedo run on it, and I know I stood over on the starboard side and watched all 10 torpedoes as they were fired. We completed our run, and then we turned, and we was trying to retire into our own smoke, and then we was hit for the first time with the 3 14-inch projectiles, mostly amidship. The ship just completely rose up out of the water and came down with a thud. That projectile, it's got a whoa, whoa like that, and it's a terrible noise. For some reason, I just turned and started walking forward, and I only got just a few feet. And as a round came in and killed most of those guys that I was standing with. And I look back and I recall, I can still see it today, one of my friends from about half up, and his arms are still moving.
Helpless in the water and pounded by the Japanese heavy guns, the Johnston turned to help its fellow destroyer. Its young crew members began to think the unthinkable.
And I truly believed that that was the last day of my life.
With the Johnston dead in the water, Captain Evans had no option but to abandon ship.
It was a bad feeling. First of all, you'd never seen anything like you saw that day, and you was one of those that thought, well, this can't happen to me, Yeah, it wasn't a good feeling at all.
As the survivors huddled together on life rafts, they thought that rescue would come swiftly.
As the day wore on and the evening came on and began to get dark, well, then you begin to wonder, now, where in the hell are they? And why aren't they up here, to retrieve us?
Within 2 hours, the Johnston, the Hull, and the escort ship Roberts had been sunk, and the survivors were scattered over miles of ocean. But the U.S. Naval Command was fearful that if a ship should find them and stop, it would be a sitting target for enemy submarines. They issued a terrible order, permission denied to save survivors.
Our task force commander knew exactly where we were. He knew we were in the water. Other ships was asking permission to come back and get us, and it was denied.
The men had sacrificed themselves to save the carriers and protect the landings at Leyte Gulf. For the crews of the destroyers abandoned at sea, the horror was far from over.
We saw our first shark about 3 o'clock that afternoon. Somebody would scream out when one of them had a hold of him. And we had a chief petty officer that one of them got him in one of his thighs, and then just a few minutes afterward got him in the other thigh. And so when they'd scream out, you knew that a shark was hitting somebody.
For the next 2 days, the men fought the sharks and the elements.
The water was cool at night, but the sun was hot in daytime. And of course, we were from here up, we're getting burnt real bad. This little float wasn't very big that we had, and we put the most wounded inside that, which was a couple of guys that was burnt real bad and couldn't see. Then dark or just a little bit after dark, both of them died. So we let them slip beneath the surface.
When finally rescued, out of the combined crews of over 600, only 147 survived from the Johnston and 86 from the Hull. The heroism of the destroyer crews was summed up by an official naval historian. In no engagement of its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption. Following this victory, the Philippines were successfully recaptured. General MacArthur had fulfilled his promise to return. A destroyer was there to help fulfill that vow. But for all its armament, the destroyers were small and vulnerable warships. And it was not only from the hands of their enemies that the men of the destroyers faced death. Sometimes, nature would unleash itself with devastating consequences. By late 1944, the Fletcher-class destroyers were now coming off the slipways at an incredible rate of 4 each month. As soon as they had their shakedown cruise, they were hurled into the bloody battle for the Pacific. American forces slowly recaptured each island, but the price in lives kept going up. With the Japanese refusing to surrender, it was a case of kill or be killed. But for the men of the destroyers, death sometimes came from forces which even they could not fight. The USS Spence was part of the escort for Task Force 38 during the autumn storms of 1944.
If you was watching the ship, it put it clear out of sight where it would go below the waves, and you think, well, it's gone. Then next time it'd be up above you, 50, 60 feet or more. Sometimes wind was so strong, if you into the wind, you couldn't breathe.
The next day, the weather became worse. Then the storm became a typhoon. In winds of over 100 miles per hour, huge quantities of water swamped the Spence.
I was on the watch on that, and I had all kinds of rain gear on and everything, and the earphones, and It seemed awful funny, like when the ship laid over on its side and you're walking on the side of it, and then all of a sudden it turns all the way over and throws me out in the water. Then I didn't dream there'd be a storm enough to sink any ship, any man of war ship, anywhere.
About 11 a.m., with winds now reaching over 120 knots, the Spence capsized. Of the 330 men aboard, only 24 survived.
Everybody was below deck in the engine room and the fire rooms and that, they never had a chance. The ship upside down, there's no way in the world they could ever get out.
2 other destroyers also sank in the typhoon, and the mighty carrier Hornet had its flight deck ripped apart. Nearly 790 officers and men lost their lives during the storm. But the men of the destroyers were about to face a far more deadly onslaught. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese, desperate to defend their positions, turned their fury into a new form of attack, the kamikaze. Again, it was the destroyers that were in the front line of battle. Their mission was clear: target and kill any kamikaze aircraft in the vicinity of an aircraft carrier.
It was a total suicide effort. First time I saw it, I couldn't believe it. They came in, and we were in a big formation. We had destroyers in a circle in the middle of the big ships. And they had to fly over us to get to the big ships. And I would see these planes coming in and see the shells going out. And we fired the 5-inch guns because they had a proximity fuse, which meant they would explode and shrapnel would go all over the place. And 40 millimeters going out, the 20 millimeters going out when they get close enough. And you just sit there and say, well, how can they get through it? There's so much metal up there that they're bound to run into something. But it didn't hit the right place, then this thing still flew. So we just grit your teeth and you keep shooting, bang, 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 until finally you'd hit it, or it would fly over you and go look for something else.
On April 6, 1945, the USS Bush was on picket duty off the coast of Okinawa when CIC's radar picked up a large formation of enemy aircraft.
We first spotted them about 50 miles away. We saw a pretty large group, probably 10 to 20 planes. And here's another group behind that. And then almost immediately a third group, and then a fourth group. And so we knew this was going to be a big one.
Within minutes, the Bush knew that they were the target.
We had a plane coming in at low on the water, on our bow, right for us. We fired everything kind of loose. The 5-inch, the 40s, the 20s, all were firing, and didn't stop him. A very skilled pilot, and he knew what he was doing, and he hit us exactly right in the spot, the most perfect spot possible, and that is right between the two stacks, right at the waterline. Then about a half hour later, another one came in a little higher and peeled off and came in and hit us on the other side exactly the same way. And then about a half hour later, a third one came in and crashed into the forward right at the forecastle, and that was the most damaging hit in terms of people killed, because we had people out on deck there, and he sprayed gasoline, flaming gas, all over that forward deck.
With its hull almost torn in two, the Bush sank. 87 of its crew members went with it. In the weeks that followed, the destroyers faced more than 1,500 kamikaze attacks. By the war's end, they had fought in nearly every naval battle. In total, over 1,300 battle stars were awarded to the Fletcher class. But a bigger accolade awaited them. In August 1945, Admiral Bull Halsey ordered that 3 destroyers, the USS Nicholas, O'Bannon, and Taylor, accompany the mighty battleship Missouri to accept Japan's surrender. Because of their valorous fight of the long road from the South Pacific to the very end.
We met the Japanese destroyer that came out of Tokyo Bay with the harbor pilots and peace emissaries. And we sent our whaleboat over there and picked them up and then transferred to the Missouri and to other ships in the fleet. It was quite an honor.
By the end of World War II, 175 of these tough destroyers had been built and sent into battle. 25 had been lost. The hulls of steel are long gone, but for the men of the destroyers, the fighting spirit lives on.
Thank God for the Fletchers.
It was the finest destroyer that was ever built.
Be a captain of a destroyer. You're king in your own world.